why don't we move forward to the next slide? Thank you everyone for attending our webinar. We have 2 webinars happening this month, but this is one that we've been really looking forward to, the top findings from the 2021 Competitive Enablement Report. And this is a report that we are releasing today. And actually all of the people who've registered for this webinar, so you will be receiving early access to this report. We won't really be going live with it until next week. So thanks for attending. Thanks for taking some time out of your day. I know this is a really busy time of year for all of us. So appreciate that, but hoping that we're going to deliver some really awesome value for today in the content and the findings of what we're seeing in organizations and their respective competitive enablement programs. Big shout out to Skip that we want to give. Skip was a really great partner for us in building this competitive enablement report. They are the Society for CI Professionals is, I believe, exactly what that acronym stands for, but Cam, their executive director, was instrumental in helping us to collect our research. A lot of the Skip members have participated in contributing their perspective in this. So a huge shout out to Skip and their efforts. And we look forward to working with them more on sharing out the results of this report into next year as well. So few housekeeping items before we begin. We will be sharing the full report and the slide deck presentation from today out with you at the end of this presentation. Thank you for correcting me, Tracy. Skip, strategic and competitive intelligence professionals, not society. So thanks, Tracy Berry, always keeping me on my toes. Appreciate that. So we will also be doing a Q&A at the end of this webinar. You'll notice in your bottom panel, you have a couple of options. One is for chat. Feel free to use the chat to have conversation with each other, to connect with other people that are a part of the presentation, to share your thoughts. Share your questions that you would like answered in the Q&A. So you can submit your questions just through the Q&A button that's at the very bottom of your screen, maybe depending on how this appears for you. We'll go through those questions at the end of the presentation. And then last thing is participate in some of the polls. So I think 2 or 3 times during this webinar, we're going to be asking some polls. Should be really quick and easy for you to just submit your answers. So a little heads up on that. And then I'm about to hand this over to Vincent. Vincent Lo is our VP of Product Marketing at Clue. Before working at Clue, he actually was, I believe, maybe our first customer, one of our first customers. He led the marketing insights and strategy team over at Hootsuite, and now he's our go-to guru on all things product marketing and competitive intelligence. So plays a big role over here at Clue, and excited to hear this presentation from you, Vincent. So I'll turn it over to you. And then at the end, I'll pop back in to help read some of the questions for you to answer.
All right, thanks, Katie.
Yeah, no worries.
Let's get started. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the why and how this competitive enablement report came to be. Talk a little bit more some of those really interesting key findings we saw, but really how to actually go about actioning on it, making some value and some sense out of those findings, and really wrap up with what are some of the takeaways as we plan and think about 2021. How do we go about really increasing the value of competitive intelligence for your organizations? And Katie's going to pop back in with to help me with the Q&A. So let's get started. Why did we actually go about doing this? I think one of the things that we actually hear a lot from our customers and really competitive intelligence people that we actually talk to is that competitive intelligence is really valuable for every part of our organization. And so the question to really want to ask is, we have a lot of internal customers, but how do we go about making sure that they're all happy? Because every single internal customer is going to be slightly different. There's no one size fits all. At the end of the day, if we're able to make our customers happy and understand how we go about making our customers happy, then they can help us do a lot of things, especially in terms of year end, quote unquote, to defend our budget and really to help us with our budget as in increasing the overall footprint and value of competitive intelligence. That's sort of the frame of mind that we actually came into. So before we get started, I actually want to ask this question to everybody. How often do you go about gauging the your internal customers and in terms of their satisfaction and happiness. I think the poll just popped up, but also tell us in the chat, what do you actually go about doing to gauge his happiness? Do you do anything? Is there a particular technique or a particular tool that you use to really help you gauge at that? And while this poll is actually going, I'm going to talk a little bit about who we surveyed and how we went about doing it. Let me move this poll out of the way. Give me 1 second. There we go. So who did we actually survey? We went out and actually surveyed both the competitive intelligence professionals and business stakeholders. And specifically, we were actually looking at business stakeholders that are at the director level, senior manager level, VP level, executive level, to get their sense of what they want to see out of competitive intelligence. We did this across 18 different industries, actually 18 plus industries, and across all kinds of departments in the entire organization. Now, before I dive into the finding, let's see the results from the poll. How often do we gauge internal customer audience? So there's a good chunk that says done on a quarterly basis and a good chunk that's done on every chance I get. I'm really interested to hear what the every chance I get really mean and how it's actually done. But unsurprisingly, there's also a group of never thought of it and really done only once only once. I'm guilty of that. I think I've only done that twice at Clue, so I need to step up my game there as well. And there's also this 5% that's other. So what are those other? Tell us about that in the chat. So now let's move into the findings. And I think this is one of the key shocking findings that we saw. Only 21% of the business stakeholders feel that they are sufficiently supported by the CI function. And so if you flip it around and think about it, that means 4 out of 5, 80% of business stakeholders are saying that their own team or department has to do their own competitive intelligence. Now, depending on the type of day, depending which side we bet, I actually get out of, I find that shocking and not shocking at the same time. But why are they actually doing it for themselves? And why are they actually doing their own competitive intelligence? There are really three key themes. One is because they are not supported by the core and central CI team, and that they're responsible for CI for either their own business or their own region, or that their product line or business unit is one of those niche areas that doesn't really get the overall support and love that they really need. The second big theme was they really need to go deeper and augment findings, or go broader and augment findings that the core CI team wasn't able to supply. The good news is a very small chunk of the business stakeholders actually said that they were not supported by the CI function at all. Now, the question is, for the ones that are doing and are responsible for CI for their own business or augmenting findings for themselves, what does that really mean? So we asked a different question. We asked a question on how do you want and what do you like to have improved in your company's overall CI program? And really, it came down to, again, two broad themes. One, which was the intel they actually received from the core and central CI team either really wasn't helpful, it wasn't relevant, or it wasn't deep enough for their own needs. And so if you actually think about it, that means that there's actually something that we can actually do as CI professionals fairly quickly. It is to make sure that all the intel that we are supplying to our stakeholders is relevant for the roles, relevant for their objectives, relevant for the departments and priorities that they have. I know that's easier said than done, but that's what we want to keep in mind. How do we go about making sure that the intel they're actually getting is relevant? How do we go about making sure that the relevant intel they're getting is actionable? And then finally, how do we go about delivering all of that in a way that is digestible? Because what good is intel that's delivered that's actionable if people are not getting to it? And the second broad theme about all of this was, even when the intel was actually available, it just couldn't find it. They needed the intel faster to be able to answer their own questions faster. Sometimes it could actually mean that the analysis, deep analysis already done, is buried in a Google Drive. I know we have that problem. I know I've had that problem in my previous company at Hootsuite as well. So is there a way for us to think about how do we go about increasing the happiness of our internal stakeholders by giving them a single source of truth that they can easily go to and find the intel that they're looking for, the relevant intel they're looking for? How do we go about ensuring that, because everybody's doing their own CI, that everybody understands the roles and responsibilities of who's going to the different types of CI that's being done? Is there a way to consolidate down to one single owner that helps to divert and redirect requests and information requests? And finally, another thing that we also saw out of a lot of qualitative research was really customers, our internal customers, are have a certain expectation of when they will get their answers back, answers to their question. They want their questions to be answered faster, to be more responsive. So there needs to be an expectation of SLA. Now, it might be one clear SLA for the entire organization, but sometimes you can also think about in terms of one clear SLA per stakeholder group, because in all likelihood, you would want to have a shorter SLA for your executive group. And then for these niche competitors in a very small business unit that is experimental, the SLA might be actually different. So how do we go about ensuring that we communicate all of that to ensure that customers, our internal customers, are happy with what they can expect out of getting their questions answered? And this relates to a second finding, a second key finding we actually saw. We actually saw that stakeholders and CI teams tend to slightly disagree about how and where CI should really benefit the business. Now, the good news is when we actually looked and contrasted CI teams versus stakeholders and asked them the question, what benefits do you expect out of a company's investment in CI? The good news is both sides do see net new revenue objectives. So improving sales performance or improving product strategy and product development to increase the growth side of net new revenue to be at the top of the list. So that's the good news. But what happens next is interesting. When we actually start to dig into what stakeholders really want next, which is to help increase customer retention, to increase net retention, to help fuel growth for the business, that's where things kind of start to diverge. You see that on the CI side, improving customer retention as an objective, as a benefit, gets pretty far down the list. So we said, okay, well, if that's the case, then what do CI teams as their number one priority in terms of benefit to the business? How does that contrast to what stakeholders actually want? How does that contrast? And so CI teams themselves, they see themselves having the ultimate value, help them benefit for business by improving overall executive decisions, executive strategy, executive alignment, and business alignment. And so we actually look at that and say, well, what about executives? How did they go about seeing that? Well, the funny thing is, an interesting thing here is that for C-level executives, and maybe these is really silent times and sign of where we are in the world with the pandemic, that C-level executives really do see customer retention objectives and increasing customer and improving customer retention to be their number one hope for the benefit out of a CI program. Whereas they see value for themselves as pretty far down the list, 4 or 5 items down the list. So there's a little bit of misalignment there. And so I think my takeaway from all this set of data and this set of key findings here is that in terms of how we go about helping to increase our customers, our internal customers' happiness, we can do that very simply by alignment, by aligning to what customers, our internal customers, expect and want as benefit, and really to get clear on what some of those expectations are for those benefits, how we go about helping to drive improved customer retention. I'm going to pause there for a second for any questions or comments.
We just had one question, but it just says, what is SLA? You might have answered that since it was first asked.
Yeah, it's the service level agreement. So it's expectation on a certain response time for a particular request or particular type of request.
Okay, that's all the questions that we have right now.
So I'm curious, how do the folks in the audience respond and react to some of these data points we actually saw? Meanwhile, I'm going to move on to the next part. So then a third key finding is about how do we go about increasing that happiness overall. And then when we actually looked at it, we actually saw that overall, a large chunk, and almost 90% of folks who identify themselves as having a development CI program, were really not happy with their internal level of maturity, and also were not satisfied with the value that they're delivering to their stakeholders. So what does developing CI programs actually mean? And before we do that, let's start with our second poll. So how satisfied are you with your own level of maturity in your CI program? We'll let that run for a couple seconds, but I will quickly talk about how we defined the level of maturity. So when we asked the question, how would you rate the overall maturity of a CI program in your own company? Really, we kind of bucketed things into, are you in a very reactive and ad hoc manner? Or do you describe yourselves as having just a budding function or emerging function? And that's what we group together as a developing CI practice. And at the other extreme, you have the fully scaled and systematic type of CI function that are far more mature. And in those cases, we saw that, unsurprisingly, we had 18% or so of organizations actually are willing to and want to describe themselves as mature, whereas the large majority, almost half of them, are developing CI, just emerging function or really not having much of function in the first place. So the question that we asked was, and maybe let's take a look at the poll result before I actually dive into the findings. So we can see that in most cases, the data here actually is very similar to what we actually saw in our own research. So in the large majority of cases, respondents were overall were neutral or dissatisfied with their maturity of CI and are really looking for ways to help improve and increase that maturity so that they can help increase the satisfaction and happiness of their stakeholders. So what can we actually learn and copy from the mature CI function? That was a question that we're asking ourselves. What do these mature CI programs actually mean? In a lot of cases, what these mature CI functions really mean is that they have a lot of systems and processes that were documented, published, and defined. They have started to standardize on KPIs and metrics and technologies, and have a fairly clear sense of roles and responsibilities that the organization across the board is adhered to. Because as I said before, one of the findings we saw was that a lot of people are doing their own competitive intelligence. So how does all that come back into play into the central repository for competitive intelligence? And at the end of the day, one of the key markers that we also saw in terms of a mature program is the level of executive visibility. In fact, it's only when we actually get into a state of mature CI program where we were clearly seeing that executive sponsorship, having at least one executive that's a sponsor of the CI program, is starting to take place. Now, having said that, we also haven't seen a lot of organizations that actually responded by saying that they have a full executive bench being on board with the CI program. It is still owned and sponsored by one executive. So I think we can still see that there's some room to grow there. What about developing CI programs? How do they contrast? As you can see, the marker, I guess, of a developing CI program is that either things weren't really defined, or if they're defined, they are loosely defined, sitting around in documents that are kind of half finished, and doesn't get a whole lot of visibility. Doesn't get a whole lot of visibility across the organization, doesn't get a whole lot of visibility by the executives, and the KPIs and metrics themselves doesn't get a whole lot of visibility. And one of the biggest challenges we also hear a lot is, as a budding function, I'm a team of one, so I might be able to operate and follow codes of ethics and other practices that mature CI programs would actually follow, but I'm not going to have time to document all of that because I don't need that scale. So that's definitely recognized as well. But really, the marker of a CI program and developing CI program is how well are things actually documented in paper and also shared and broadly followed and adhered to. So then when we think about these developing CI programs and where they can really improve in terms of increasing that internal customer satisfaction and happiness as an end goal, there are really three places that can be focused on. Really, it's around the roles and responsibilities, especially since everybody's doing a bunch of their own competitive intelligence anyways. It's just making sure that there's clarity around who's doing what, there is clarity around what's available so that there's less duplicative work, and that the role of the central CI function and all the other people who are doing CI are cleared and shared. And the second is just around KPIs and metrics, which I'll dive into very quickly. There's definitely a clear, interesting finding that we will be talking to. And then the third part is just around starting to standardize on technologies and processes. And it's a standardization that I think is interesting because, yes, we all have access to certain technologies for ourselves, but when it comes to having a broader organization being involved, and having roles and responsibilities across the organization from competitive intelligence to work together and collaborate together, the standardization of technologies and processes is going to be one of the enabling factors for scaling across the entire organization. What about technologies? And sorry, what about metrics and KPIs? And one of the things that we originally assumed, the hypothesis that we had was mature CI functions are going to be leaning much more towards business outcome types of metrics or revenue-based type of metrics. And that wasn't actually true. The only thing that was true was that they have a good blend of KPIs and metrics in place. Whereas if you look at the developing type of CI functions, it is pretty clear that there are either no KPIs or metrics in place, or that there is simply aspirations and not really tracked and measured properly. What happens consistently that we're seeing is that irrespective of whether a function is mature, maturing, or still developing, if there are KPIs that are in place, it is a good blend of KPIs. That is a blend of project-based, output-based, and also revenue-based KPIs, and that they are starting to have these KPIs and metrics being measured and shared consistently, and the KPIs and reports themselves to be shared more broadly, so that they're earning the visibility across the entire organization and executives. One other thing about developing CI functions, I think the data actually says for themselves, is think about investing in training, because irrespective of how mature and immature the organizations in terms of CI function capability is, there's always going to be a need to up our game. And so the question is how to go about doing that. And you can clearly see here in the data is that the developing functions haven't thought about how to invest into actual training. There's going to be just a lot of experimentation on the fly, on the job, no training at all. And what we're seeing from this mature CI function is that they have actually built in and formalized either internal training programs or mentorship programs, or sometimes even external mentorship programs, whereby it helps their internal teams to get better and better in their job. So one of the things we actually saw was also the idea of the Google popularized 10% time. I know that Google has slowly to peel that back, but I think there's a notion there of being deliberate with a certain bucket of time so that your learning as you go, your on-the-job training is much more focused and about improving the practice and all. And finally, there are great organizations like Skip, where I just came off of this session with a lot of technology and practice leaders on how do they go about using technologies to improve the scale of their function, and really borrowing the best practices and learning from best practices from other practitioners. Oh, and I almost forgot about this. So there's this bonus finding that we actually saw. We also kind of asked the question, what do the cool kids do? The high growth companies, the hyper growth companies. And the really interesting fact was this, that these CI functions in high growth companies are in that development stage or developing stage because they are relatively new. The organizations are in high growth and accelerating, so they're not haven't invested deeply into formalizing the CI function just yet, but they are focused overwhelmingly on supporting sales organizations first. So we asked the question on, well, who is that very first primary stakeholder that is supported by CI program? And I guess the data actually says that because it's high growth company, hyper growth company where revenue growth comes first, it is that sales organization that is the first priority in terms of support. And because they are in this developing CI state, CI maturity, I think a lot of those keys that we actually talked about are going to apply. That there's definitely a opportunity to standardize technology and processes, especially since high growth companies tend to be chaotic, and that doing this early will actually help reduce some of that chaos. Similar with roles and responsibilities, everybody in hyper growth companies and high growth companies will be doing CI of sorts in their own. So think about how to broadly define, develop, and align on roles of responsibility in terms of competitive intelligence and how to bring it all in so that everybody gets visibility to what's actually happening out there. And finally, definitely focus on getting that metrics dashboard in place. You know, it's great to have these metrics to be measured and have a blend of these metrics in place, but also think about in terms of building it out so that it's a more broadly visible metrics dashboard. Again, I am really guilty of that here at Clue. We actually have done a lot of metrics in terms of competitive intelligence and how it's actually impacting business, but we haven't actually surfaced it as a regular dashboard that we can actually look at on a weekly, monthly, daily basis. So I am now going to just quickly talk about some of the key takeaways really as we think about planning for 2021, and then we'll open it up to questions and Q&A. Really, it's actually going to be fairly simple. We talked about through all of this. It is getting and building a metrics dashboard in place, be it in an existing BI tool, in your own spreadsheets, or some other type of CI tool that actually can help you build on a metric dashboard. But have that in place so it becomes visible. Start to standardize some of those processes and technologies. That's really key to help you scale. And start to clarify and document what are the different types of roles and responsibilities that the core CI function is going to own and take on, and what other stakeholders as they do CI, how that actually folds back in so that there's no duplicative effort. And finally, definitely look into your company's culture and objectives and identify how would CI actually go about contributing to success and net retention objectives, because that is top of mind for executives and for other business stakeholders. We all want to serve, as CI professional, we all want to serve a strategic role for our executive audiences and really to support them in their goals and objectives. So I think it's pretty clear that we can actually get a lot more of that airtime if we focus on the year objectives first, which is sales and retention objectives, so that we can um, get a lot more visibility, a lot more airtime in terms of those strategic decisions that we all want to contribute into. And finally, get RAD, right? That's relevant, actionable, and digestible. I made that up totally. But I think is a good mindset for us to have. And I think this is where I'm going to stop this presentation. There's a lot more findings in the actual report that the marketing team and will share out with you all. But really, I think there's a call to action here for you to think about in 2021 and into 2022 as well, which is what can we actually do as a competitive intelligence function to enable every part of our organization with CI? That might mean how we go about contacting CI will be slightly different. That might mean how we go about making the intelligence that's already being done much more relevant to our audience and their departments and their teams and their roles. That might also mean how we go about ensuring that competitive intelligence that's being done by other parts of our organizations gets folded back in and then re-enabled across the rest of the organization.
Hey, Vincent.
Yes.
A couple of sort of questions and comments that were shared to me through your presentation, both about the customer retention side. So Tracy sharing the disconnect on priorities and outcomes between the C-suite and CI teams is pretty alarming. She'd like to hear more about CI for customer retention. And similarly, Lauren was asking, so maybe a bit more on your thoughts about CI for customer retention. The second question was around sort of where does Clue fit into that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think retention comes into play in a couple of different ways. If you think about retention, by definition, it means how do we go about protecting our customers? Well, what does that really mean? Especially because of the environment that we're in right now, we do all expect, and we hear this from our customers as well, that our customers are at risk because my competition is going to come after my customers in order to fuel their own growth, because it's a tough environment out there. Every single opportunity, every single deal that we're facing with, especially in the B2B space, is going to be much more competitive. So really helping to our customer success teams, our account teams, to be able to defend our customers from competition's attack. I think that's one key aspect of it. What does that actually mean for CI? Well, there are a couple of things. One is arming our customer success teams and our account teams to be able to have their conversation to help them identify when competition is going after our customers and our accounts. I think the second is also when our customers are under attack, really, how do we go about strategizing and working with the account teams to defend and to make sure that we are actually talking to the specific pain points that we can address that our competition can't really address, right? Just to make sure that that's really clear and known. Because if you think about how customer success have operated before, they were much more focused on just ensuring that our customers are using whatever solution it is at the maximum value. It was much more about adoption of tooling, adoption of value versus a selling and defending against the competition. I think that's one aspect of it. The other part of retention that actually is important to think about is about net retention, right? So yes, there's a notion of keeping and making sure that our competition is not coming after our accounts and stealing our customers. But the second part is we also want to ensure that our customers are getting more and more value and getting more sticky with us. So as we help our customers to expand their usage and value of our tool, they're also naturally going to think about, okay, if I'm increasing our spend on Clue per se by 15, 25, 30%, how does that contrast to what other solutions out there? So really arming the success teams and account teams with information they need about the value differences between your own products, your own solutions, and the markets and what's available out there. And for us at Clue, I think a lot of what we do in terms of enabling sales, in terms of the content enable sales, actually lend fairly naturally into customer success world, because with customer success and account teams, really it's all about identifying when the competition has gone after our customers, identifying for specific keywords and how to react to them, and then also when certain keywords or triggers are occurring, well, how do you go about describing the value of your own solutions versus the feature comparisons, because feature comparisons really also work even less well in defending account environments.
Okay, another question from Dallas. Are there any example SLAs, code of conduct, or other standard documentation available that we have for reference, or anything that you could suggest?
Code of conduct and code of ethics, that's certainly something that we can actually ask our friends over at Skip, because they have that well documented. I think it's publicly available. If not, then we can definitely ask for permission to borrow and maybe even come up with our simplified version of that. In terms of SLA, really, it's fairly straightforward. It is just a matter of mapping out when a certain group is asking for a certain type of information, what can they expect in terms of days, hours, weeks in response. The tricky part is always just mapping out a stakeholder and the type of intelligence and the parameters on the type of intelligence they're asking for, so that it can be documented about, is it going to be a 24-hour turnaround? Is it going to be a 48-hour turnaround? Is it going to be a 3-day turnaround? I think the one SLA that you don't have to document is when it comes to from your executives, your chief executive. If your CEO is asking for a certain type of competitive intelligence information and intel, the SLA definitely should be react ASAP, even though the reaction might be, we'll get back to you ASAP.
I don't have any other questions right now. Oh, here we go. How can we leverage Clue to address the needs of different stakeholders across the organization? That's from Arnav.
That's a great question. I think that is something that we can all think about, the different audience and what they're looking for, and how that's actually organized into the different deliverables that are available in Clue. I know that with Clue, we talk about battle cards a lot, talk about sales battle cards a lot. I think that's a natural way to start to think about it in terms of the folks that actually need the content that's like a battle cards, your customer success teams, your sales teams, your sales development representatives. Like, what are the different roles and how to their own versions of battle cards look like. There is going to be a lot of reuse in terms of content that's relevant for sales, that'll be relevant for SDRs, and that will be relevant for success. But there's also specific types of content that's more relevant. So for example, a customer success and account rep will probably care more about feature comparison, how it actually works, than your sales rep should care about. And that's also the type of content, the feature comparison type of content is also super relevant for your product and engineering audiences. So think about using the idea, the quote unquote idea of a battle card to surface different views of the competitive content that's available in Clue to your different audiences. We are doing, what we're doing internally is a sales battle card, a customer success battle card, a product quote unquote battle card. We even have our own QBRs and win-loss analysis that's also sitting in Clue. That is surfaced and opened up as a quote unquote battle card, but it's nothing more than a report, a view of a selection of insights that we have actually collected within Clue, if that helps.
Can you speak to governance related to CI content?
Sorry, the governance related to CI content?
Yeah.
I think I can interpret that as who should be responsible for for what's the right word of putting it, for giving the stamp of approval on the content that actually goes out. That is going to be something that needs to be mapped out in that roles and responsibilities that I was talking about. So in a lot of cases, especially in smaller teams, smaller CI functions, really the CI function, the CI person is going to be responsible for looking at all the different pieces of content that's coming in and giving that stamp approval. Yep, we acknowledge this and this is going to be useful for X, Y, and Z purposes. Or acknowledging that this is a piece of intel that we still need to validate. Or also the third thing would be to acknowledge that this is a piece of intel that is missing other pieces of intel to make it really solid. So that's something that we do as well in terms of Clio, like in terms of how we operate. Like we have intel that actually comes in and content that actually comes in from all the different parts of our organization. And I'm responsible for basically triaging content that actually comes in to say, yes, it's approved, moving to particular battle card or swim lane, or to open it up and say, okay, we really need more than this, but here's where it actually sits.
And then one more question. How do you, for your 2021 forecast, enable the CI thinking inside your own development teams?
Inside your own development teams, as in product development teams? Is that?
Might be, maybe Philip can answer. Yes, exactly.
So the good news is product and development teams are naturally going to be doing their own CI anyway. It is, again, that roles or responsibilities that really need to be clarified and mapped out and also aligned to, because all product teams that I've personally worked with, if they're not getting the CI that they actually need, they're going to just jump out and get access to the tools that they want to have a comparison against. I'm not going to talk to and I'm not going to speak to some of the ethics around that because I think it is very much dependent on the situation and how that mapped out. But let's assume that that level of feature comparison gap analysis has been done. So the question is, if that's going to be done already, how do we go about ensuring that that's actually being shared, right? And that's where that roles and responsibility come into play, because you as a CI function can really drive this culture of open collaboration and sharing by giving guidance on and giving guidance and giving that I guess the governance that we were just talking about in terms of what the intel actually says, who it could be shared to, what are the limitations of that intel that was gathered and collected. Did that answer the question?
I will let you know when I hear. Yes, it does. It did.
Perfect.
We don't have any other questions right now, so we can give a couple of seconds here for any sort of final questions in case anyone has anything.
So Katie, I'll ask you that question again. What is that aha moment that you saw when you went through and looked at the results that we had from findings from the report?
I mean, I think it's still the same. Like customer retention to me is a really interesting area of opportunity, really interesting to see the disconnect between CI teams and their priorities versus other stakeholders. So I think there's lots of opportunity for the future. That's still maybe like my one takeaway. Are there any ones from you?
Yeah, like I was saying much earlier, I think the one interesting aha moment for me was none of the data, none of the insight actually pointed to a need or I guess a want for a auto magic button, because I think that's one of the things that we hear a lot, anecdotally at least, that says, wait, is there a magic button that actually gives us all the intel in the world about my competition? If so, am I out of a job? And I don't see any of that out of any of the data that we actually saw.
Very fair. So we will be sharing, as I said at the beginning of this webinar, I believe today we should be sharing out the slide deck. You're good with that, Vincent, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And the full actually competitive enablement report, which goes into much greater detail than even I believe what we presented today. So all of the people who registered, all of you that are listening are going to get first access to this report. We'll send that out today as well as the slides. And otherwise, that's all. Thank you very much for attending, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.